My husband's first love wanted to see a high-altitude bungee performance. So even though I was 3 months pregnant, they suspended me from a platform 1,000 feet in the air. I was shaking all over, crying and begging them. I'm terrified of heights, and I have a heart condition. Please, the baby and I will die. But my husband, Julian, only sneered impatiently. Stop acting, Chloe. You used to climb trees to rescue stray cats. Now you're playing the coward? Our 5-year-old son Leo joined in. Chloe, Vivian wants to see a duo performance anyway. Why don't you show her a cool jump with the baby in your tummy? I stared in shock at the two most important people in my life. A bitter, suffocating pain filled my chest. Before I could say another word, Julian pressed the release switch. Cheered on by my son, Vivian pushed me off the edge with a giggling laugh. The feeling of weightlessness engulfed my entire body. A blood-curdling, agonizing scream echoed through the rooftop lounge. Yet Vivian only pouted, looking offended. Chloe's screams are so loud and scary. Is she doing this on purpose just to ruin my birthday? Julian and our son immediately rushed to comfort her. Don't be mad, sweetie. We'll make her do it again for you in a minute. Yeah, if she doesn't perform well for Vivian, I'm never calling her mom again. A sharp, stabbing pain pierced my heart. The world around me turned completely black. When I opened my eyes again, I realized my soul was floating right next to Julian and my son. Recognizing that I was dead, I instinctively reached down to touch my stomach. I'm so sorry, baby. I couldn't protect you. But before the grief could even sink in, the conversation between Julian and Vivian made me shake with pure rage. Vivian leaned against the rooftop railing, her face twisted in mockery. Why did she stop screaming? Is she throwing a tantrum because she didn't want to perform for me? Julian scoffed. She probably thinks she embarrassed herself. She's just playing dead. Let's see how long she can keep up this act. Crank up the tension on the rope. But I wasn't acting. I was dead. Down below, suspended by the bungee cord, my corpse hung limply. My eyes were wide with terror, and my face had already turned a bruised, suffocating purple. If they had pulled the rope up just once to look, they would have known. The person who was begging for her life just minutes ago had already taken her last breath. Perhaps because I remained silent for too long, Vivian pouted again. Julian's impatience grew. Chloe, stop playing dead. If you ruin Vivian's birthday party, you will pay for this. Leo also frowned, crossing his little arms. Yeah, Chloe. Don't make Vivian unhappy. Looking at them, I let out a bitter, ghostly laugh. Every time I didn't cater to Vivian's whims, Julian would be the first to point fingers at me. And once Leo grew older, Julian taught him to do the exact same thing. Together, they bullied me. Seeing that I still didn't respond, Julian and Leo went over to the control panel to teach me a lesson. My lifeless body jerked and swung helplessly in the cold night wind. I hovered right beside them, screaming at the top of my lungs that I was dead. But no one could hear me. Infuriated by my silence, Julian snarled at the staff. Turn the machine to maximum power. Since she likes to play games, let her swing out there all night. I tried to stop him, throwing my hands out, but my ghostly fingers slipped right through his chest. Ugh, what a buzzkill, Vivian sighed. Let's go somewhere else to celebrate. Julian took Leo's hand with one arm and wrapped the other around Vivian's waist. He didn't look back once as they walked away. Before leaving, he gave a cold order to the venue staff. Don't bring Chloe down until sunrise. Watching their retreating figures, the last warmth in my heart froze over. My eyes felt empty, but as a spirit, I couldn't even shed tears. Just when I thought my body would rot high up in the air, a strange, invisible force suddenly yanked my soul. It dragged me right back to Julian's side. I looked up. He had taken Vivian back to our house, the home I had lived in and decorated for 5 years. The moment Vivian sat down on the sofa, Leo ran to the fridge and grabbed a bottle of premium sparkling water for her. Here, Vivian. This is your favorite. Chloe wanted to drink it last week, but I didn't let her. Seeing the proud, smug look on my son's face, my heart completely shattered. Last week, I had a raging fever. I was so thirsty that my throat felt like sandpaper. I opened that bottle of water and took one sip, only for Leo to throw a massive crying tantrum. At the time, I thought it was just a child being possessive over food. Now I realized the truth. I simply wasn't worthy of drinking it in his eyes. Watching the three of them interact, a horrifying realization washed over me. This home, which I had painstakingly put together, had already been taken over by another woman. The custom throw pillows on the couch, the ones I was never allowed to touch, were custom made for Vivian. The expensive designer tableware I was forbidden from using was a matching 3-piece set for Julian, Vivian, and Leo. Even the spare bedroom, which Julian promised would be for our second child, had been fully decorated as a guest suite just for Vivian. Late at night, Vivian quietly slipped out of her bedroom. Curious, I floated after her. She stopped in front of the giant wedding photo of Julian and me hanging in the hallway. Looking at my younger self in the photo, smiling with pure adoration at Julian, it felt like a lifetime ago. Back then, I thought I was the luckiest woman in the world. I had a man who loved me unconditionally. We went from high school sweethearts to husband and wife, like a fairy tale. But everything was a lie. Vivian's long, manicured fingernail scraped against the glass frame, making a screeching sound. Chloe. If the Julian family hadn't been on the brink of bankruptcy back then, and if I hadn't wanted to escape his debts by going abroad, do you really think you'd ever have the chance to marry him? I froze, staring at her in disbelief. Then a wave of dark amusement hit me. The woman Julian loved so desperately only cared about his money. Meanwhile, the woman who had sacrificed everything for him, the woman currently carrying his unborn child, had been murdered by his own hands. Vivian's voice turned incredibly venomous. So what if you got married and had his kid? His heart and his son's heart still belong to me. Honestly, if you had just stepped aside and given me my spot back, you wouldn't have had to die tonight. Her words hit me like a lightning bolt. It was a setup. My death wasn't an accident. They had planned this. Why? Why would you do this to me? My baby was only 3 months old. He didn't even get a chance to see the world. I screamed in agony, lunging forward to tear her face apart. But my hands passed right through her body. I was dead. I collapsed to the floor in despair, forced to listen as Vivian muttered the rest of the truth to the empty hallway. She let out a low chuckle. You actually thought Julian loved you? He just needed a free maid to take care of his kid while he built his empire. The second his company secured that new venture capital, he immediately wired me $1 million for my allowance. $1 million? I snapped my head up to glare at her. Years ago, when Julian's company was failing, he told me he desperately needed cash. I sold the cottage my grandmother had left me in her trust fund to give him the money. But just 2 days later, he claimed there was still a $1 million deficit. So, I sold all the heirloom jewelry my parents had given me. I worked 3 different low-wage jobs, sleeping only 3 hours a night, just to scrape together that $1 million. And he gave it all to his first love as pocket money. I laughed. A silent, hysterical laugh. Chloe, you absolute fool. What are you doing staring at that photo? Julian's voice suddenly echoed as he opened his bedroom door. Vivian instantly wiped the malice from her face. She rushed over, wrapping her arms around his neck, looking deeply hurt. If my parents hadn't forced me onto that plane to Europe years ago, the woman in that wedding dress would be me. Julian's eyes flickered with guilt. He gave her a somewhat dismissive pat. Don't talk nonsense. I have a wife. With that, he gently untangled himself from her grip, sat on the couch, and began scrolling through his phone. Vivian stood frozen, her eyes flashing with anger, but Julian avoided her gaze. I found the scene pathetic. He had just murdered his pregnant wife, and here he was, playing the role of a devoted, conflicted husband. Just then the front door clicked open. 5-year-old Leo walked in, rubbing his sleepy eyes. Julian, where's Chloe? Isn't she back yet? Looking at my son's familiar face, I felt a chilling sense of dread. I couldn't reconcile this sweet-faced little boy with the monster who had cheered as I was pushed off the platform. Vivian knelt down, putting on her sweetest voice. Chloe went to stay at a friend's house, sweetie. She won't be back for a few days. Leo peeked at Julian cautiously, then leaned in to whisper in Vivian's ear. Vivian, now that the obstacle is gone, can you finally be my real mom? The obstacle. He was talking about me. My heart felt like it was being shredded by 1,000 knives. I never could have imagined that my own flesh and blood viewed me as a mere roadblock in his life, waiting eagerly for me to die. Vivian smiled warmly and nodded, kissing his forehead. Yes, baby. I'll stay here and take care of you and Julian forever. Leo clapped his hands in joy. Yay. Chloe was always so embarrassing at school. I've wanted you to be my mom for a long time. Julian heard every word. Yet he remained completely indifferent, his eyes glued to his phone screen. At that moment, I finally understood why Leo had insisted I attend Vivian's birthday party. He had complained that I was too basic, and didn't fit in with the wealthy parents at his private school, which supposedly made his classmates ignore him. He said if I didn't go to Vivian's party, his friends would laugh at him. It was all a trap. A trap to lead me to my execution. Pure, unadulterated hatred consumed me. My soul burned with a pain so intense it felt like it was ripping apart. In the next second, I was dragged away. I was back by my body, but I wasn't on the rooftop anymore. I was inside a rumbling, foul-smelling garbage truck, buried beneath heaps of trash and discarded party props. The driver's voices drifted in from the front cabin. Man, that party venue throws away some realistic stuff. That dummy looks exactly like a corpse. Let's just dump it at the landfill. They thought my dead body was a discarded Halloween prop. No matter how loudly I screamed, no sound came out. I could only watch in horror as the truck drove toward the city landfill. An hour later, the truck stopped. My body was brutally dragged out and tossed into a massive pile of rotting garbage. Flies swarmed. Stray dogs lingered in the distance. A heavy bulldozer slowly rolled forward. Tons of waste were dumped over me, burying my body deep beneath the filth. My consciousness plunged into darkness once again. When I woke up, the invisible force had dragged me back to the house. In the living room, Julian was pacing back and forth, furiously shouting into his phone. Vivian sat on the couch, looking highly annoyed. I don't care. Dig up the whole city if you have to, but find Chloe. She has to be my date for the gala tomorrow night. This gala was something Julian had been preparing for over a year. If he couldn't convince a powerful female tech CEO at the event to invest in his firm, his company would go under. Julian had mentioned before that this CEO only did business with family-oriented, devoted family men. If I didn't show up with him, it would ruin his reputation. No wonder he was panicking. Vivian rolled her eyes. She knew how important this night was for you, Julian. She's clearly hiding on purpose just to screw you over. If she doesn't show up, can't I just go as your date? Vivian asked, testing the waters. No, Julian snapped. Going alone is one thing, but if I bring you. He trailed off, but I knew what he was thinking. He was terrified of being labeled a cheater in the high society circles. Vivian immediately burst into tears. I've given up everything for you. I live like a hidden mistress in the shadows. We can't even hold hands in public without hiding. Oh God. Julian, always soft-hearted toward his mistress, folded within 3 seconds. He pulled her into his arms, murmuring apologies. As I watched them, a terrible sense of unease crept over me. Days bled into one another while I hovered around them in a state of constant anxiety. Until one afternoon, Julian's phone rang. Through the speaker, a gruff, distorted voice demanded, Hey Julian, if you want your pretty little mistress to stay alive, you better prepare $50 million. Vivian was kidnapped? If your wife Chloe isn't happy with the exchange, we can't guarantee what will happen to your side piece. Chloe? Me. But I was dead. How could I have kidnapped Vivian? Julian's face went pale, then flushed with rage. He grabbed his coat and bolted out the door. Chloe, you smart little bitch. You really need to be taught a lesson. He dialed my number repeatedly, but it went straight to voicemail every time. Since you want to play dirty and kidnap Vivian, don't blame me for what I do to your parents. He slammed his foot on the gas, and his sports car roared down the street. I flew after him, screaming at him to stop, but he couldn't hear me. Julian arrived at a modest, older apartment complex on the outskirts of the city. He kicked the front door open, confronting my startled father. Where is Chloe? Did she kidnap Vivian? Hand her over right now. My father stared at him, utterly confused, but tried to remain calm. I was about to ask you where Chloe is. We haven't heard from her all day. Today is my birthday. She never misses my birthday. How could she possibly be kidnapping anyone? My mother rushed over, her face pale with worry. Julian, what's going on? Chloe hasn't called us. Has something happened to our baby girl? But Julian didn't believe a word. He shoved my father backward. He tore through the small apartment, throwing drawers and kicking down closet doors, finding nothing. Losing his mind, he grabbed my elderly father by the collar and slammed him against the wall. My mother screamed, trying to pull Julian away, but he violently pushed her aside. She stumbled, her forehead striking the sharp corner of the dining table. Blood immediately began to pour down her face. If you don't tell me where Vivian is, I will beat both of you to death. Julian, stop. I didn't kidnap her. Leave my parents alone. I threw myself at him, screaming, crying, trying to claw at his eyes. But my hands kept passing through him. I beg you please. They are old. Let them go. Blinded by fury, Julian signaled his bodyguards. Trash the place. Make them talk. The heavy-set men began kicking and punching my elderly parents. Julian pulled out his phone and started recording a video. Chloe, look at this. He sneered into the camera. If you keep hiding, I'll make sure your parents don't survive the night. I floated beside my battered parents, watching them writhe in pain on the floor. My soul felt like it was being ripped into shreds. Driven to absolute despair, my father grabbed my bleeding mother's hand. With one final, desperate look at the apartment, he dragged her toward the open window and jumped. Just then, a bodyguard ran into the apartment, holding his phone out. Sir, something's wrong. Your wife. The sound of 2 bodies hitting the asphalt 4 stories below was not a crash. It was a dull, wet thud that vibrated through the floorboards, traveling up, through the soles of Julian's designer shoes and straight into his marrow. Silence dropped over the trashed living room like a suffocating shroud. The wind from the open window whipped the sheer white curtains, tossing them into the room like frantic, pale ghosts. On the table, the smear of my mother's fresh blood was already beginning to dry into a dark, rusty brown. Julian stood frozen, his hand still half raised from when he had recorded his threat. Sir. The bodyguard who had rushed and stood framed in the broken doorway, his phone trembling violently in his grip. His face had completely drained of color, his chest heaving as if he had run 5 miles through a swamp. Julian didn't look at him. He took 2 staggering steps toward the window, his eyes fixed on the empty air where my father had just dragged my bleeding mother. Into the void. What did you just say? Julian's voice was barely a rasp, stripped of all its previous arrogance. The police, the city sanitation department. The bodyguard's voice cracked into a terrified sob. They found a body at the South District landfill 3 hours ago. The dental records just cleared the national database. Mrs. Vance. It's Chloe. Julian turned around slowly. His pupils had contracted into tiny black pinpricks. What kind of sick joke is this? Julian sneered, though his lower lip began to tremble uncontrollably. Chloe put you up to this, didn't she? How much did she pay you to play along with her little kidnapping stunt? Tell her to stop hiding behind corpses and bring Vivian back right now. Sir, look at the screen, the bodyguard screamed, shoving the phone into Julian's face. I floated beside Julian, looking down at the screen. It was an official bulletin from the Metropolitan Police Department's Homicide Division. Attached was a crime scene photograph taken under the harsh, blinding glare of forensic floodlights. There, half buried under crushed cardboard boxes, rotting food waste, and rusted metal scraps, lay my corpse. My skin was no longer pale. It was a mottled, bruised slate gray. The floral sundress I had worn to Vivian's birthday party was shredded, caked in black industrial slime. But the silver necklace around my neck, the one Julian had given me on our college graduation, engraved with the coordinates of the bench where we first kissed, was still intact, reflecting the police flashbulbs. Beneath the photograph was the preliminary medical examiner's report. Victim: Chloe Vance, female, 27. Estimated time of death: 72 to 96 hours prior to recovery. Primary cause of death: acute cardiogenic shock/cardiac arrest induced by extreme atmospheric stress and psychological terror. Secondary finding: deceased was approximately 12 weeks pregnant. Intrauterine fetal demise secondary to maternal death. Note: body was transported post-mortem via municipal sanitation vehicle from the Grand Horizon Sky Lounge waste chute. Julian stared at the phone. The air in his lungs seemed to solidify into jagged glass. 72 to 96 hours. That was 3 days ago. That was the night of the rooftop party. That was the exact moment Vivian giggled. Leo clapped his hands and Julian pressed the red switch that dropped me into the abyss. No. Julian whispered. He dropped the phone. The screen shattered against the linoleum. No, that's impossible. She was just playing dead. She was just trying to ruin Vivian's birthday. She was screaming. I heard her screaming. She stopped screaming after 4 seconds, Julian. I whispered into his ear, my spectral voice curling like smoke through the cold room. And you told the staff to leave me hanging until sunrise. Down below on the street, the first sirens began to wail. Neighbors were screaming. A crowd was gathering around the 2 shattered bodies, lying on the pavement. Julian stumbled backward, tripping over my father's overturned chess set. Wooden pawns and kings scattered across the floor, crunching beneath his heels. Pressed both hands against his temples, his breathing turning into ragged, animalistic gasps. If she died 3 days ago. Julian choked out, his bloodshot eyes darting toward the window, then toward the blood on the table. Then who called me? Who kidnapped Vivian? Julian didn't have time to process the unraveling of his sanity before the police breached the apartment. For officers burst through the doorway with weapons drawn, shouting commands, pinning the 2 bodyguards to the floor. An older detective with graying hair and iron-sharp eyes stepped over the threshold, his badge glinting under the flickering hallway light. Julian Vance? Detective Miller barked, kicking the heavy wooden chair away from the window. You're under arrest for aggravated assault, home invasion, and felony reckless endangerment resulting in death. You don't understand. Julian shrieked, thrashing wildly as an officer twisted his arms behind his back and slapped cold steel cuffs around his wrists. My wife was murdered. Look at the news. Someone dumped her in the trash. And Vivian, my friend Vivian, has been kidnapped. The kidnappers framed Chloe. Detective Miller looked at Julian with an expression of profound, unadulterated disgust. Save your breath for the interrogation room, Vance, Miller said coldly. As for your kidnapped mistress? We found her 40 minutes ago. Julian froze mid-struggle. What? Where? Was she hurt? Did Chloe's accomplices? She was at the VIP lounge of the International Terminal at JFK, Miller interrupted, pulling a transparent evidence bag from his trench coat. She was trying to board a one-way private charter to Zurich under a forged Panamanian passport. Inside the evidence bag was a high-grade voice modulator, 2 prepaid burner phones, and 3 cashier's checks drawn from Julian's corporate reserve accounts, totaling exactly $48 million. The extortion call you received this afternoon? Miller leaned in close, his voice dropping into a deadly whisper. It came from a prepaid SIM card, registered to a man named Marcus Kane, her ex-fiancé from Switzerland. The same Man, she's been wiring your company's venture funds to for the last 6 months. The world seemed to stop spinning. Julian's jaw hung open. A string of thick saliva dripped from his lower lip onto his designer collar. No, Julian stammered, shaking his head frantically. Vivian loves me. Gave up her career for me. She was crying in my arms this morning. She didn't give up a career, Mr. Vance, Miller sneered, signaling the officers to haul him up. She was running from 3 separate fraud indictments in Geneva. She found a rich, gullible fool with a devoted wife, bled him dry, used your 5-year-old kid to push your pregnant wife off a building, and tried to fleece you for another $50 million before skipping the country. The officers dragged Julian out into the hallway. I floated beside them, watching Julian's face contort into a grotesque mask of horror, disbelief, and mounting hysteria. As they pushed him down the narrow concrete stairwell, Julian's gaze caught the open landing on the ground floor. 2 black body bags were being zipped shut by paramedics on the pavement. Outside, one contained the father who had taught me how to ride a bicycle. The other contained the mother who had stayed up all night, sewing my wedding dress. A pool of dark, thick blood was spreading across the asphalt, reflecting the flashing red and blue lights of the squad cars. Chloe, Julian wailed, his voice cracking into a high-pitched, broken screech that echoed off the brick walls of the alley. Chloe. The county medical examiner's facility smelled of industrial bleach, formaldehyde, and the metallic tang of frozen iron. Detective Miller led Julian down the subterranean corridor. Julian's suit was wrinkled, covered in dust and dried mud from his arrest. His hair was wildly disheveled, and his wrists were raw and bloody from fighting the handcuffs. Standard procedure for a homicide inquest, Miller said, pushing open the heavy, stainless steel double doors. You need to make a positive visual identification. I told you I don't need to see it. Julian sobbed, digging his heels into the linoleum. I know it's her. Just let me post bail. Let me see my son. Your son is currently in the custody of Child Protective Services, Miller said, without stopping, his grip like an iron vise on Julian's bicep. And you are going to look at what you did. The coroner, a woman with tired eyes and a green surgical apron, pulled out a long metal tray from the refrigerated wall. She reached for the zipper of the heavy black plastic bag. Wait, Julian choked out, squeezing his eyes shut. Please, don't. The zipper slid open with a harsh, sharp shzzzt. The stench hit the room first. It wasn't just the smell of death. It was the smell of 3 days in a municipal landfill, rotting organic matter, sour chemicals, and stagnant heat. Open your eyes, Mr. Vance, Miller commanded. Julian opened them. And then he collapsed. His knees hit the tile floor with a sickening crack, but Miller held him up by his collar, forcing his face inches from the metal tray. There I was. My face, which Julian had once claimed was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen when we were 19 sitting on the college quad, was unrecognizable. The skin was purple and bloated, covered in lacerations from the heavy machinery that had compressed the garbage. My dark hair was matted with dried blood and filth. My eyes were still half open, frozen in the exact expression of raw, suffocating terror from the moment the rope reached its limit. And beneath the ripped fabric of my dress, my abdomen was sunken, bruised black and blue where the harness had dug into my flesh as my heart gave out. Look at her hands, Julian, I murmured, floating right beside the coroner's table. Look at my fingernails. Julian's gaze drifted downward. My fingernails were torn to the quick, bloody and splintered. The autopsy shows extensive defensive trauma to her own hands, the coroner explained in a dry clinical tone. When her heart went into ventricular fibrillation, she tried to claw at the chest harness to relieve the pressure. She was conscious for roughly 45 seconds after the drop. She felt every single beat of her heart failing. She felt the lack of oxygen in her brain. She knew she was dying, and she knew nobody was coming to pull her up. Stop. Julian whimpered, tears and snot pouring down his face, soaking into his shirt. Please God, stop. And here, the coroner continued, pulling back the sheet slightly to reveal a small glass specimen container sitting on the tray beside my hip. Inside the jar, suspended in clear preservation fluid, was a tiny translucent form no larger than a plum. A male fetus, the coroner said. 12 weeks, 4 days. Perfectly healthy. Until maternal cardiac arrest cut off the placental blood supply. He suffocated in the womb while you were driving your mistress home for sparkling water. Julian let out a sound that didn't belong to a human being. It was a guttural, tearing howl. The sound of a beast having its organs ripped out through its throat. He lunged forward, slamming his forehead against the edge of the stainless steel tray over and over again. Clang, clang, clang. Blood burst from his forehead, splattering across the white plastic sheet, covering my legs. Chloe, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. I didn't know. I swear to God I didn't. No. he screamed, his voice turning into bloody foam. Wake up. Please just slap me. Curse at me. Don't leave me like this. Chloe. I hovered above him, looking down at his bleeding face with cold, crystalline indifference. You knew, Julian, I whispered. I told you I was terrified of heights. I told you I had a heart condition. I begged you on my knees. And you smiled while she pushed me. Child Protective Services had placed 5-year-old Leo in a temporary juvenile holding facility on the west side of the city because Julian's legal team had secured a temporary 24-hour medical furlough under armed escort before his formal arraignment. Julian was permitted a 30-minute supervised visit in the family consultation room. The heavy steel door clicked open. Leo walked in. He was wearing his favorite custom-made designer jacket, the one Vivian had picked out with my grandmother's trust fund money. When Leo saw his father sitting at the table, wrapped in a hospital gown with thick white gauze taped across his bloody forehead, the boy didn't run to him in tears. He stood by the door, crossing his little arms, his face twisting into that familiar, petulant. Julian, Leo demanded, his voice sharp and entitled. Why am I in this ugly place? The beds are hard, and the lady wouldn't give me ice cream. Where is Vivian? Did she buy my new Lego set yet? Julian looked up from the table, his bloodshot eyes vacant, hollowed out by a bottomless abyss of grief. Lao. Julian whispered, his voice trembling. Come here. Come ugudetti. Leo didn't move. He kicked the leg of the plastic chair. I don't want to hug you. You smell bad. Where is Chloe? Tell that stupid woman to come pick me up. If she doesn't bring my iPad right now, I'm going to tell Vivian to throw all her clothes in the garden again. The social worker standing in the corner looked down at her clipboard, her jaw tightening in disgust. Julian flinched as if he had been struck with a hot iron. He reached across the table with shaking hands, grabbing his son's small shoulders. Leo, listen to me. Listen carefully. Chloe, your mother, she's dead. Leo blinked. He didn't cry. He didn't gasp. He tilted his head, a childish, cruel smirk spreading across his lips. Is she really dead? Leo asked, his eyes brightening with genuine excitement. Yay. That means Vivian is my real mom now, right? Can we go live in the big house with the swimming pool? Vivian said once Chloe was gone, we wouldn't have to see those poor old people on the outskirts anymore. The words hung in the air, toxic and putrid. Julian stared at his 5-year-old son, the boy he had spoiled, the boy he had taught to disrespect his mother, the boy he had raised in his own image. And for the first time in his life, Julian saw the monster he had created. She wasn't that stupid woman, Leo, Julian whispered, his voice dropping into a terrifying, cracked register. She was your mother. She carried you for 9 months. When you had pneumonia at 2 years old, she slept on the floor beside your crib for 3 weeks until her own kidneys failed. So what? Leo pouted, trying to squirm out of his grip. She was boring. Didn't wear pretty dresses like Vivian. Her hands were rough. She embarrassed me. At school. Vivian didn't care about you, Leo. Julian roared, shaking the child so violently that the social worker stepped forward with a warning hand on her radio. Vivian stole $48 million and tried to leave the country. She called you an annoying little brat in her text messages to her lover. She used you to murder your mother. Leo froze. The word murder seemed to pierce through the thick layer of spoiled entitlement. No. Leo's lower lip finally began to quiver. Vivian loves me. Vivian is pretty. Chloe is the bad one. Chloe is the one who didn't want to jump. Chloe is dead, Leo. Julian leaned in, his face twisted in a mixture of hatred and agony, forcing the child to look into his bloodshot eyes. And your grandparents are dead. They jumped from the 4th floor because of what we did. You have no mother. You have no grandparents. And after my trial next month, you will have no father. Leo looked around the room, at the cold, bare walls, at the armed guards by the door, at the social worker who looked at him with icy pity, and finally at his bleeding, ruined father. The reality of his absolute abandonment crashed down upon his 5-year-old mind. Like a falling mountain, Leo let out a piercing, terrified shriek. He fell to the floor, kicking and screaming, clawing at his own face, vomiting his lunch onto the linoleum tiles. Mommy. Leo wailed, his voice raw, turning back into the helpless child he had pretended not to be. Mommy. I want mommy. Chloe, come get me. Mommy, please. I stood in the corner of the room, watching my son writhe in his own filth. A mother's instinct is supposed to be eternal. It is supposed to forgive all sins, heal all wounds, cross the boundaries of life and death to comfort her weeping child. I reached down. My ghostly hand hovered an inch above his trembling shoulder. Then, I remembered him standing on the rooftop, his 5-year-old face full of spite, laughing as he said, "Why don't you show her a cool jump with the baby in your tummy?" I pulled my hand back. My heart was no longer breaking. It was turned to stone. You called her an obstacle, Leo, I whispered, turning my back on him. And obstacles do not come back. The trial of Julian Vance and Vivian Cross became the most sensationalized criminal proceeding in the state's history. The media dubbed it the Sky Lounge execution. Every major news outlet ran the surveillance footage from the rooftop platform. The audio, recovered from the venue's high-definition security microphones, was played in open court before a packed gallery and a jury of 12 men and women, whose faces grew grimmer with every passing second. The courtroom speakers filled with the sound of my desperate, sobbing voice. I'm terrified of heights, and I have a heart condition. Please, the baby and I. Vidi. Followed by Julian's cold, mocking laughter. Stop acting, Chloe. You used to climb trees to rescue stray cats. Now you're playing the coward. And then, the sound of the pneumatic release. The 4-second scream that cut off into an abrupt, sickening silence. And finally, Vivian's light, musical giggle. Chloe's screams are so loud and scary. Is she doing this on purpose just to ruin my birthday? By the time the recording finished, 3 members of the jury were in tears, and the judge, a hardened veteran of the criminal bench, was gripping his gavel with white knuckles. Vivian sat at the defense table, wearing a plain gray prison jumpsuit, her bleached hair showing 2 inches of dark roots, her face stripped of all makeup. Beside her, Julian sat in handcuffs and leg irons, staring blankly at the polished mahogany table. The evidence is incontrovertible, the district attorney stated, standing before the jury box. This was not an extreme sports mishap. This was a calculated, depraved heart murder of a pregnant woman, orchestrated for the amusement of a mistress and executed with callous, predatory malice. And when the victim succumbed to the terror inflicted upon her, the defendants left her hanging in the freezing wind like a piece of discarded meat, instructing staff to leave her until sunrise. Vivian's attorney attempted to argue diminished capacity and lack of homicidal intent. Vivian herself took the stand, trying once more to play the fragile, tearful victim. I didn't know she was really sick, Vivian wept, dabbing at her dry eyes with a paper towel. Julian told me she was always exaggerating. I just wanted a fun birthday party. Julian was the one who controlled the machine. He was the one who pressed the button. Julian slowly turned his head. For the first time in 6 weeks, he looked directly at the woman he had destroyed his life for. He let out a low, dry chuckle that echoed through the quiet courtroom like autumn leaves scraping across concrete. I gave you my wife's cottage, Julian said, his voice completely flat, devoid of all life. I gave you her grandmother's heirlooms. I gave you the $1 million she earned working 3 jobs until her hands bled. Julian, shut up. Vivian's lawyer hissed. You took everything, Julian continued, ignoring the judge's gavel banging for order. And then you laughed when she fell. You laughed while my son clapped his hands. Julian looked up at the judge. I plead guilty, Your Honor, Julian said clearly, to murder in the first degree, to the manslaughter of my unborn child, to the wrongful deaths of Arthur and Eleanor Vance. Give me the maximum. Give me whatever the law allows. Bang, bang, bang. Order in the court, the judge barked. 2 days later, the sentence was handed down. Vivian Cross. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole at the maximum security state correctional facility, plus 25 years for interstate wire fraud and grand larceny. Julian Vance. Life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, to be served in solitary confinement at the state penitentiary, with all personal and corporate assets seized under civil asset forfeiture to be placed into a public restitution trust. As the bailiffs led Vivian away in chains, she screamed and cursed, spitting at the cameras, her face contorted into the visage of a rabid animal. Julian didn't fight. He walked with his head bowed, his eyes fixed on the floor, dragging his iron chains with a slow rhythmic clank. 6 months after the sentencing, Julian sat in an 8x10 concrete cell in the maximum security wing of Blackwood Penitentiary. The walls were painted a sickly, peeling yellow. The only window was a 4-inch slit near the ceiling, crisscrossed with heavy steel mesh. Julian had lost 50 pounds. His cheekbones protruded sharply beneath gray, papery skin, and his hair had turned entirely white. Every night, the same dream found him. He was standing on the rooftop platform of the Grand Horizon Sky Lounge. The wind was howling at 1,000 feet. The stars above were cold and indifferent. And there, standing on the edge of the abyss, was me. I wasn't purple or bloated. I was wearing my favorite cream-colored sweater, the one I had knitted myself during our 3rd year of marriage. My stomach was round, full of the life that should have been his son. Chloe, Julian would whisper in the dark of his dream, reaching out with trembling hands. Chloe, please, let me pull you up. In the dream, I would turn my head and look at him with eyes full of quiet, boundless sorrow. You can't pull me up, Julian, I would say, my voice carrying on the night breeze. You let go. On the night of October 24th, the anniversary of Vivian's birthday, Julian woke up. At 3 a.m., the cell was freezing. The air was thick with the scent of ozone and falling rain. He climbed onto the rusted metal frame of his cot, reached up to the iron vent, grate near the ceiling, and tied the strip of heavy bedsheet he had braided over. 3 weeks. He looped the other end around his neck. He didn't leave a note. He had no one left to write to. His parents were dead. His company was bankrupt. His son was in a state group home, screaming at the walls, refusing to speak to the psychologists. Julian stood on the edge of the metal bed frame, looking out through the 4-inch slit at the distant, glittering lights of the city skyline. Chloe, he whispered into the empty concrete box. I'm coming. He stepped off. The drop was only 3 feet. It wasn't 1,000 feet in the air. There was no cold night wind, no audience of cheering socialites, no 5-year-old child clapping his hands in delight. There was only the harsh, snapping sound of cervical vertebrae fracturing in the dark. Julian's body jerked twice, his heels drumming a faint, frantic rhythm against the concrete wall, before swinging slowly in the stagnant air of the cell. The invisible tether that had bound my soul to the mortal world snapped with a sound like a harp string breaking in an empty hall. The coldness that had frozen my spectral form for an entire year suddenly began to melt. A soft, golden warmth enveloped me, lifting me up through the ceiling of the prison, up past the razor wire fences, up into the wide, open expanse of the night sky. Below me, the city stretched out like a carpet of glittering jewels. The Grand Horizon Sky Lounge was dark, its rooftop platform abandoned and sealed behind yellow police tape. The landfill on the southern edge of town had been covered with fresh soil, and wild clover had begun to sprout across the mounds. Chloe. A voice called my name, not with anger, not with mocking cruelty, but with the boundless, gentle love of 40 years. I turned around. Standing in the golden light were my mother and father. My mother's forehead was smooth, unblemished, free of the blood that had stained her face on that terrible afternoon. My father stood tall, holding a wooden chessboard under his arm, smiling at me with his warm, crinkled brown eyes. And in my mother's arms was a small bundle wrapped in a soft, sky-blue blanket. The baby opened his bright, dark eyes, looked up at me, and reached out a tiny, perfect hand. I looked down at myself. The ragged floral dress was gone. The bruises were gone. My hands were whole, smooth, glowing with the clean, untouchable light of the dawn. I stepped forward into my parents' arms, and took my baby into my chest. The pain, the terror, the suffocating weight of 5 years of betrayal, all of it, dissolved like morning mist beneath the rising sun. I didn't look down at the earth again. I held my child close, took my father's hand, and walked with them into the light where no one could ever push us again.